Lieutenant G knocked on the door to Zuko's room. There was no answer. "Sir?" he called through the metal door. "It's Lieutenant G. May I enter?" G and Iroh went back a long time. They had met for the first time 7 years ago when Iroh had been one of the leading generals of the Fire Army. They had only spoken briefly, but the lieutenant had been impressed by the general's wit and intuitive understanding of both his troops and the enemy's troops. Iroh's decision to end his 600-day siege at Ba Sing Se had made him unpopular in most circles, but G had never thought worse of him for it. On the contrary, there is no dishonor in facing the fact and admitting your enemy is better than you, especially when the alternative is keep fighting until all your men are gone. G hadn't known Iroh well before he'd been assigned to the prince's ship, but his respect toward the old man has only increased. If anything, as the lieutenant spent 3 years watching him patiently guide a Decor teenager through endless rocky patches. Now that G knew more of Zuko's past, he understood Iroh's attitude a bit better. The prince wasn't just a spoiled royal prat, like G had sometimes thought over the years. After Zuko's family abandoned him in a traumatizing way, the kid needed someone to look after him, and General Iroh had been that someone, the very picture of a loving and peaceful old uncle. Not that G would let the facade fool him. Retired or not, the Dragon of the West was nowhere near as harmless as he led people on. The Dragon of the... G gulped. He really hoped that was just a nickname, but under the circumstances... "Come in," Iroh's voice answered from inside Prince Zuko's room. His tone wasn't cold or uninviting, but the shortness of his greeting told G that the old general wasn't in a chatty mood. Not that G was surprised. The lieutenant had been worried and upset when he learned that Prince Zuko was back, but he wasn't well. He could only imagine what Iroh was going through. G had suggested they find a healer for the boy, but Iroh had declined his offer. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary. This isn't a natural illness." After that, Iroh had ordered G to call the crew back from their search. The news of Zuko's return spread fast, and all the crew were back on the ship waiting for further orders. Except there hadn't been any. The old general hadn't left his nephew's side. The crew wasn't expected to look for a healer or find a healing facility. They weren't going after the Avatar. In short, they had no standing orders, which had left a lot of time for gossiping. G wasn't sure what to make of this story, but Prince Zuko being a dragon, it sounded impossible. People didn't just turn to dragons, and yet, when the water spirit had attacked the ship during the storm, it had mentioned something similar. "Please don't tell me you thought you could casually turn into a dragon and still fly under everyone's radar." One coincidence too many? One way or another, something strange was definitely going on. Hoover and Lee weren't liars or known for this level of exaggeration. If they were lying about what they had seen, they were both such good actors they could easily join a traveling circus and perform at fire festivals. Personally, G hadn't made up his mind yet. He trusted that Iroh could give them an explanation sooner or later, and if Iroh said the rumors had no foundation to them, G would believe him. Lieutenant G bowed deeply at the old man sitting at his nephew's bed. Iroh was wiping the teenager's forehead with a wet cloth. He looked G in the eye and nodded, but then turned his attention back to the young man. Zuko was sleeping restlessly. The prince's left shoulder had been bandaged thoroughly. "Sir, how is the prince?" G started. The question wasn't just about being polite. Several crew members were worried about Zuko, and since everyone would know G had been to see Iroh, the lieutenant wanted to have some answers to take back to the men when he returned. G wouldn't be lying if he said he wasn't personally a bit attached to the prince as well. The boy was like a snotty younger brother to him. Asking how Zuko was doing really had nothing to do with manners. "His shoulder has taken quite the banging, but Sergeant Cho patched it up," Iroh answered. "It's the illness that truly worries me." Iroh's voice was even, despite everything. There isn't much I or anyone else can do for Zuko right now, other than be here for him. Still, my nephew is a fighter, and I believe that he will fight his way through this. Do you know where the illness came from? G asked. If this is the same one that's been going around, we have medicine for it. Iroh shook his head. This is not a natural illness. G gulped. He didn't want to upset Iroh with questions, but he had to know. Is it to do with this dragon thing? That question seemed to startle Iroh a bit. He looked at the lieutenant again, but looked more surprised than angry. No, I don't think it is, Iroh said finally, his tone unreadable. Which was good as confirming there really was a dragon thing, even if the illness wasn't related. When I say this isn't a natural illness, Iroh went on, I mean that this is an illness of the spirit, not of the body. His words worried G. I didn't know an illness of the spirit could manifest in such a tangible way. The body and the spirit are tightly connected. When one is suffering, it affects them both. Iroh's logic was hard to argue against. I suspect this isn't a new wound, but an old wound we opened. Why it happened now, after all these years, I do not know. Iroh's voice sounded resigned. G frowned. An old wound? So, you know this might happen? Then why didn't you... He paused to think it over. You suspect this is to do with what happened 3 years ago? Iroh nodded. An assault like the one my nephew has put through wounds a man on a deeper level than just flesh. G nodded. He understood. Being hurt by someone you trusted leaves scars in the spirit, and those scars last longer than physical injuries. After the Agni Kai, my nephew lost everything. We all cope with loss in different ways. Some cry, some scream, some become bitter and angry. Zuko found his own method of coping. He took all of his pain, frustration, and disappointment and turned it into determination. Even after everything Ozai put him through, my nephew never stopped believing in his father. The only way Zuko could cope with his banishment was believing that it was necessary, that he had deserved it, that his father had been right. Now Iroh's voice had a new layer to it. Hate. Zuko was angry at his father, but he didn't know how to deal with that anger, so he ended up taking it out on those close to him and on himself. You and the rest of the crew have had to withstand your share of my nephew's moods, and for that I apologize. But despite how sure and driven Zuko appeared to be on the outside, he is still very young and very confused. As I told you earlier, my nephew has been going through many changes in his life lately. Now, something has pierced through his armor of indifference so badly that the feelings he'd been storing inside him have manifested as physical symptoms. Iroh sighed and turned his full attention back to Zuko. As much as it pains me to see Zuko suffer like this, on the long run, this could be a good thing. Letting go of everything you believe in isn't easy, but once it's done, once Zuko has dealt with his confusion and anger, he can finally start to heal. So far, he's been trying to become the kind of prince his father wants him to be. Soon, I hope, Zuko will be free to find his own way in the world and grow into the kind of man he was meant to be. G nodded, mainly because he wasn't sure what to say. He felt a twinge of guilt for all the times he'd been rude or indifferent toward the boy, while Iroh had held his patience. I understand and agree with you on what you just said, G finally put in. Everything but one thing. Iroh turned to look at him. And what's that? Zuko didn't lose everything when he was banished. He still has you, G said sincerely. General Iroh looked mildly surprised by G's words, but he nodded. Turning to tend to Zuko again, Iroh said, I will not abandon my nephew. Everyone who knew Iroh at all could vouch for that. Even the prince must have known it, and he trusted hardly anyone. Not even us, his crew, G realized. Zuko couldn't risk trusting us, because Zuko couldn't risk trusting us, because he would have risked being let down again. And that's why he kept all of his secrets to himself. All of them, including turning into a dragon. Jeez, what a mess. I wish that was enough, Iroh sighed. I consider Zuko my son, but I am not his father, and sometimes it feels like years of understanding and patience for me isn't enough to mend the damage Ozai caused in a matter of seconds. Though I do fear, Iroh added, that Ozai's influences have been infecting my nephew's stability even before the Agni Kai. Normally, G would have been shocked to hear anyone speak of the Fire Lord in such a criticizing tone. Undermining the Fire Lord's authority would be punishable by death. Not even the Fire Lord's brother would have been allowed to imply that Ozai's influence on his son was a negative thing. Even if they were only speaking of Ozai's parenting skills, not his qualities as a leader of their nation. Now, G just nodded. Fire Lord or not, no one should have done that to their own son. G had had his doubts about the Fire Lord's infinite wisdom and righteousness even before he was assigned to this mission, but he never truly questioned the Lord's greatness before today. Surely the leader of the greatest nation in the world was a wise and just ruler and had his people's best interests in mind. That was something every soldier had to believe in. The moment you started questioning the people giving you your orders, you began to question all the things you had done when following said orders. When at war, the troops needed to have faith that even if they didn't see the point behind some of the decisions made, there's a reason for them. Someone greater than any one man was leading them, and he knew what he was doing. Believing in anything else was demoralizing, and claiming anything else was treason. Lieutenant G had made the mistake of questioning his orders. He'd been told to lead his men to try one more time to take on the Earth Kingdom fortress that had been fighting for days. G had believed that with all of his heart that one more attack on the fortress would win them nothing, and it might result in the death of him and all of his men. Therefore, G had ignored his orders. As punishment, he had been demoted, his ship taken from him, and he was ordered to serve under the banished prince on his hopeless quest. Lieutenant G's faith in his nation's leadership had faltered that day, but questioning the field generals was still different from questioning the Fire Lord. But after the story General Iroh had shared with the crew that morning, G found it very hard to have faith in the Fire Lord, or even respect the man. Zuko moved a bit, turning restlessly from side to side. The boy had been brought aboard the ship wearing dark, nondescript clothing. Not an unusual look on the prince. Now he was shirtless. The bandage supporting his shoulder was the only thing covering his bare torso. Zuko was laying under a thick blanket, but still enough of his skin was exposed that G could see a great number of bruises and scars on the boy. Most of them were old scars, from years of relentless training and fighting, but some looked fresher. Beads of sweat were falling down Zuko's face. He was even paler than usual. He didn't look well at all. Is there... Lieutenant G hesitated a moment before asking. Is there a risk that Prince Zuko will not recover from this illness? G didn't want to add to the general's worry, but he had to know. All battles, even those of spirit, have their risk. Inner conflict and grief can be enough to drown a person's will to live, Iroh said solemnly. Then again, my nephew is a fighter. He has fought his way out of situations worse than this. I believe he will not only come out of this alive, but also stronger than before. G nodded. Everyone aboard the ship would agree that Zuko was determined to the point of unreasonable. Someone like that wasn't easy to snuff out, try as you might. The prince had turned into a good kid, even a decent officer. The kid could be rude from time to time, but deep down, Prince Zuko, just like his uncle, cared for the safety of his men. There just weren't enough leaders like that in the Fire Nation anymore. It was a real shame that the prince was unlikely to ever become the Fire Lord. General Iroh, the lieutenant began, I think you should have a word with the crew. Many of them are concerned and confused. The general turned to look at G. He looked very tired, but nodded. You're right. As much as I prefer not to leave my nephew's side, explanations are overdue. Iroh wiped Zuko's forehead one final time. Then the old man rose to his feet and straightened his robes. I'm sure Zuko preferred to tell you the tale himself, but since he is not in a position to do that, I'll do my best to answer the men's questions for him. The story might even be a bit clearer told by me, Iroh added in a lighter tone. My nephew has many virtues, but the art of storytelling is not among them. Cho can monitor Zuko while I address the crew. Would you stay with him while I go and fetch your medical officer? I can look after the prince the whole time, G answered. In fact, I insist. The lieutenant was curious to hear what the general had to say, but after having forced Iroh to leave his nephew's bedside like this, the least he could do was take up his place. Iroh smiled a tired but genuine smile back at the lieutenant and nodded. Seaman Hua was a bit overwhelmed by the attention him and Lee were getting since their return. When he'd seen the dragon turn into Prince Zuko, he had known things would get weird, but he hadn't expected to be drawn right into the weirdness. Iroh had finally called the men to a meeting in the dining hall. They would get some real answers, and everyone would stop bugging Ulan with questions he had no answers to. Huva didn't answer when he seen with his own eyes. Zuko was a dragon. However, now they had time to get used to the idea, Huva was starting to be worried for the boy rather than curious about his condition. Almost everyone was at the dining hall already, but Iroh hadn't shown up yet. The room was getting pretty loud as people all around Huva compared their theories on what was going on. Zuko isn't a dragon. I'm sure it was some kind of visual trick or a spirit's doing, one voice said knowingly. Don't be ridiculous. It's not just what happened today that proves the prince is a dragon. It also explains the weird behavior and what the water spirit said, another voice argued. I'm sure the shapeshifter wasn't lying to us, someone commented sarcastically. If you're so sure the kid is a dragon, then share with the rest of us how exactly that is possible. If someone of the royal line wasn't human, you would have thought someone would have noticed something was funny with the kid when he hatched. No. You aren't seeing the bigger picture here. My guess is that everyone in the royal line is actually a dragon. That's why they're so much better firebenders than everyone else. Disbelieving silence followed the last speaker. What? Oki asked as everyone stared at him. It would explain a lot. Uva, someone called over the table. You were there. What do you think? Was there something in Iroh's reaction that indicated he's a dragon as well? The man who asked the question laughed, but Uva didn't. The seaman tried hard to think of something, anything that would prove that Oki's theory was rubbish. Well, Uva said thoughtfully. Iroh looked mainly worried because Zuko was injured, but I'd be lying if I said the general looked surprised when the dragon burst into flames and turned to Prince Zuko. He didn't look scared either, just worried. Everyone sitting nearby fell silent again, but now the mood was a lot less disbelieving. A lot of people appeared to be considering it. You know, Simanu broke the silence. I saw the dragon too when it was flying across the canopy. I only saw it briefly, but it looked pretty big. If that was just a teenager, can you imagine what General Iroh would look like? As a dragon, I mean. Another silence followed as everyone pictured what Dragon Iroh would look like. The Dragon of the West, Uva realized and shivered. The main door to the dining hall opened and Iroh stepped in. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the room fell very silent. Thank you all for coming here, Iroh began and smiled at the crew, though his face was still shadowed by worry. I'm sorry to keep you waiting so long. Arrow paused, looking the men over before he continued. I do not have all the answers, I'm afraid, but I will try to answer your questions the best I can. How's the prince doing? One seaman asked. My nephew is very ill, but everything that can be done has been done to speed up his recovery. Hopefully he'll be back on his feet in no time. Many of the crew members nodded, relieved. I can also assure you that Zuko's illness is not contagious, nor has anything to do with his recent transformation. You could have heard a needle drop. I understand that Seaman Huva and Lee had already filled you in on the unbelievable yet true events that took place today. Iroh went on, sounding perfectly serious. The timing is a bit unfortunate, but I'm sure Zuko would have wanted to be here to explain this to you himself. But the situation being what it is, it falls to me to speak on his behalf. Iroh cleared his throat before continuing. The short answer to a question I'm sure almost all of you are thinking about is yes. Zuko can turn into a dragon. As unbelievable as that may sound, it's quite true. Another answer would be that no, he hasn't been able to do so. This ability is very new to him. So it's true? Seaman would gasp eyes wide. Members of the royal family can turn into dragons? Iroh blinked, looking baffled. What? No! Iroh shook his head. Members of the royal family cannot turn into dragons. I'm not sure where you heard that, but it isn't true. Zuko's transformation isn't to do with his family, but a spiritual connection. A lot of people in the room looked plenty embarrassed right about then, but Huva looked relieved, first and foremost. It would be hard enough keeping one dragon a secret, never mind two. My nephew has always had a special spiritual connection to the original Firebenders. During these past few years, he became more aware of this connection, and a few weeks ago, certain unforeseeable events led Zuko to form a whole new level of connection. While my nephew and I were scouting the area near Kimi, Zuko came across an ancient dragon shrine. It was only a few days from the winter solstice, the time when the veil between our world and the spirit realm is at its thinnest, and an old dragon spirit entered our world to have a word with my nephew. Only Zuko and the spirit know the exact details of their encounter, but from my nephew's description, I have gathered that the spirit and Zuko got along well. So well, in fact, that the spirit decided to adopt Zuko. However, it is my understanding that this kind of transformation is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. Just rare. Very rare. I had to be right about it being rare, since no one in the room had even heard of such a thing. Huva could see that Iroh meant by not a bad thing, that the prince was exceptionally dragon-like, could hardly be held against him, since it was something all firebenders, in a sense, aspired to be. Iroh took a deep breath before continuing. The reason we didn't tell you about this sooner is that, although I see nothing to be ashamed of in my nephew's new condition, I fear others might see it differently. Our nation's policy toward dragons had been inconsistent, to say the least. On one hand, dragons are the original firebenders, and thus have a special significance to our culture and bending. However, as I am sure you are all aware, this respect toward our spiritual ancestors hasn't always manifested itself in pleasant ways. Iroh took a small break to let his words sink in. There are people who wish my nephew harm, and if they learn of his condition, they will gladly spin it around to the logical conclusion that he should be locked up or worse. Much worse. The Fire Lord could contest any such interpretation of our laws, of course, if he wanted to protect his son. But I honestly have no idea what my brother would decide to do about Zuko. The fact you weren't told about this earlier does not mean we don't trust you. You have been loyal to my nephew for years, and Zuko appreciates it. However, before I or Zuko knew more of what was going on, we decided that the less people who carried the secret, the less likely it would that the word of this would reach the wrong ears. Huva felt insulted and ashamed. Insulted because although Iroh and Zuko had no requirement to give them information beyond the need to know, an irrational part of him felt like they should have mentioned something as important as this. He felt also ashamed, because he knew that Iroh and Zuko hadn't told them because the crew's past actions had given them no reason to think they would keep their mouths shut when interrogated. We told Zhao that the Avatar returned, and Zhao is definitely on the top of the list of Zuko's enemies who would use this kind of information against him. I hope that once we understand this connection better, we can move past the secrecy. For now, however, I would believe it be for the best for no one outside this ship's crew learned anything of the things I have told you here today. My nephew's life could hang in the balance. The old general spoke bluntly only when he really meant what he said. Today his tone left absolutely no room for arguments. Not that that's surprising. Nothing is more important to General Iroh than Zuko's safety, Hoover thought. General Iroh? Hoover got up and spoke before stopping to consider whether it was wise. I'm sorry that I spread sensitive information without permission to do so, and I swear on my honor that I will not tell anyone else of Zuko's condition. Hoover was a bit surprised by his own courage. Still, he meant what he said. As the man looked around himself, he noticed he wasn't the only one on his feet. Several men had followed his lead and were now also bowing to the old general. Soon every man in the room was on his feet, silently promising his cooperation. The news of this magnitude and significance couldn't stay secret forever, but they would do their best. I let the Avatar go. I was sitting next to his nephew's bedside thinking over Zuko's last words to him before the boy had fallen unconscious. I was sure the statement was key to why Zuko had fallen ill right now. Zuko didn't say he helped the Avatar escape from Zhao. He didn't say the air nomad got away. He said he let the Avatar go. The Avatar getting away was something that would have frustrated his nephew, but it wouldn't have caused a spiritual illness. Letting the Avatar go on purpose was a different story. Helping Zuko to let go of his obsession to catch the Avatar had been one of Uncle's goals for a while now. But this was not how he intended to do it. I had a plan to break Zuko's loyalty to Ozai slowly over time, to avoid something like this happening. Still, after all the things Zuko had learned of his past after finding Ursa, perhaps it was only a matter of time before he came to the right conclusion on his own. Things were happening faster than Iroh had planned or anticipated, but the situation wasn't entirely unwanted. Zuko was ready for this. After almost 2 days of illness, Zuko's fever finally broke, and although the prince was still unconscious, some color had returned to his cheeks. Zuko would pull through, and that was the main point. All else could wait. Zuko opened his eyes. His surroundings were dark, so it took the teenager a few minutes to realize he was back in his room. Zuko supported his upper body with his elbows to get a better look around himself, and noticed he wasn't alone. Uncle had nodded off next to Zuko's bed, snoring quietly. Dark shadows had formed under Uncle's eyes, making him look old. Zuko got up quietly. He didn't want to wake his uncle, who had undoubtedly been up all night. Wow, Zuko realized, it really is nighttime. I can't feel the sun outside the ship, so it must be. But it was morning when I found Uncle. How long was I out of it? Zuko's memories of what had happened after he left the Avatar in the village by the volcano were hazy at best. But now that he was thinking about it, he was pretty sure there had been other people there too when he found Uncle. The crew. At least some of his crew had been present. Zuko hadn't been worried about it at the time. He had been in such a hurry to get home that he would have landed on the deck of the ship without a second thought if that was where Uncle was. Now he felt a twinge of doubt. How much trouble had his unthinking move caused, and to whom? But Zuko thought the situation through, and came to the conclusion that if something obviously wrong had happened while he was out of it, the situation wouldn't have been this calm now. Zuko had been brought to his room, and the low hum of the engine told him they were on the move. The truth was out, but the world kept spinning. His crew hadn't abandoned him just because he wasn't what he was supposed to be. Zuko felt hungry and a bit dizzy, but he was not tired, physically or mentally. Zuko walked over the door, opened it, and slipped into the corridor. Even though the passageway was dark, Zuko had no difficulty finding his way to the bathroom. Locking the door behind him, he lit a few candles placed along the wall. He was pleased to notice that though he was still in recovery, his firebending was almost back to the usual level. Lighting the candles was barely a noticeable strain on his inner fire. The bathroom was, in one word, nice. Most rooms aboard the ship were well maintained, but it had been a stretch to call them pleasant. Space was sparse and used functionally. Although the ship was the only home Zuko had known for 3 years, almost no thought or effort had been put into its decor. Even Zuko's own room had very few possessions in it. There were 2 exceptions to this rule. Iroh's room, which was filled with all sorts of more or less useless objects that the old man had hoarded during their travels, and the bathroom. If it had been up to Zuko, the bathroom would have been just as bleak as the rest of the rooms. However, Iroh had been willing to compromise on many comforts when he'd chosen to go with Zuko into his banishment, but a pleasant hot bath had not been one of them. Uncle was to be thanked for the colorful towels and other decoration covering the walls and floor of the bathroom, and a good basin filled with water was raised on a counter. Zuko walked over to it. The water was a bit cold to Zuko's touch, but he didn't bother heating it up. He splashed cool water on his face and neck and felt immediately more awake. While drying his face with a towel, Zuko noticed his hair could use a shave. There was a short yet noticeable stubble around his phoenix tail. Zuko's hair grew like weeds. He had shaved it so many times in the last 3 years that he would have done the maneuver blindfolded while hanging upside down from the ceiling, without having to worry about accidentally cutting himself. Zuko could have cut his hair anywhere, but he did it mostly here in the bathroom in front of this large mirror hanging behind the basin. His shaving equipment was where he'd left it. The prince pulled out a small, sharp knife. The mirror, like almost everything else in the room, had been put there by Uncle in the first few months of Zuko's banishment. The prince suspected Iroh had purchased it to ensure that the teenager couldn't avoid seeing his own reflection forever. The first few times after taking his bandages off, looking in the mirror had nearly made the young man cry. Not because the scar was so ugly, although it was, but because it was a constant reminder of his shame. Over time, Zuko had gotten used to seeing his reflection, which had probably been Uncle's plan all along. These days, the prince rarely paid attention to the red area around his left eye. Now, Zuko stopped to look at the scar more closely. It looked much the same way it had looked 3 years ago, when he had seen it for the first time after the Agni Kai. The scar was a darker shade of red where the blast had burnt him the worst. The surrounding area wasn't as badly damaged, but all in all, the scar covered nearly half of the left side of his face from ear to nose. The scar reached past his hairline, and the small stubble showcased that no hair grew on that scarred area. Zuko turned his attention from his scarred eye back to the matter at hand. His hair. The healers had shaved a considerable portion of it when treating his eye after the Agni Kai. After taking off the bandages, Zuko had been hard-pressed to think of what to do with his hair. On one hand, Zuko's half-shaved head had looked ridiculous, putting extra emphasis on the damaged side of his face. On the other, he hadn't wanted to shave his head entirely. For a firebender, long hair is proof of one's skill. It showcased to everyone that a bender was so precise and in control that he could bend fire without having to worry about setting his hair or clothes aflame. All members of the royal family sported a topknot. An entirely shaved head would have set Zuko even further apart from his family than his father's banishment already had. In the end, Zuko had come to a compromise. He shaved most of his head to re-establish symmetry, but he hadn't touched his precious phoenix tail. It could be worn in a top knot when he returned to the Fire Nation. A big part of Zuko's life had been revolved around the day he would finally return home. After his return, he could think about all sorts of stuff like decor, or making friends, or leading the Fire Nation to the best possible version of herself. Zuko would do all those things that normal people do after he succeeded in his mission. Always later, never now. Zuko wasn't going home. He was free to start doing those things today, not later. Zuko looked at his hair. Instead of trying to hide the scar, Zuko had left it exposed as humanly possible. Since he couldn't hide it, trying to do so would have let other people know how ashamed he was of it. He had worn it proudly like a battle scar. Zuko was accustomed to his unusual hairdo, but today it looked a bit odd to him. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he couldn't help but be surprised at how much he had changed. He looked nothing like the 13-year-old, round-eyed child he'd once been, and not just because of the scar or the hair. He looked angry and sad and tired. He looked scary. Zuko lifted the blade, but stopped mid-motion to consider what he was doing. Suddenly it didn't matter to him that he had to cut his hair this way for the past 3 years. The only question that mattered was whether he wanted to shave his head today, and if so, why. Zuko didn't want to hide, but what was the worst thing that could happen if he let his hair grow out again? People would see that no hair grew on the damaged side of his face. But so what? His hairdo, his warrior's hairdo, wasn't serving his purpose anymore. He was still hiding behind it, hiding behind a scary mask that drew people's attention away from the scar to the overall intimidation effort that was Prince Zuko. Instead of hiding the scar, he had grown an attitude to match it. A bitter young man. That's what I look like. That's all that I am. Zuko made his cut without hesitation. A quiet thump sound woke Iroh from his sleep. He immediately grasped the most important thing about his surroundings. Zuko wasn't in his bed. Uncle blinked, now wide awake. He turned to look at the direction the sound had come from. A young, pale man stood by the door. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you," Zuko whispered and smiled nervously. Iroh's jaw hung open. For once in his life, he wasn't sure what to say, so instead, he got up, walked over to his nephew, and hugged the young man tightly. "You okay?" Zuko sounded a bit worried. "Me?" Uncle almost laughed as he pulled back from the boy. "I'm fine. I'm just happy that you're back." "I was only gone a moment." Zuko sounded definitely a bit worried now, obviously trying to determine what he had done to warrant such an overwhelming response from his uncle. "Oh, I know," Uncle reassured him, a wild smile on his lips and tears in his eyes. "I know that." Iroh wanted to hold on to his nephew a little while longer, or at least guide him back to his bed. But he didn't. The boy had known how to stand on his own 2 feet for a long time now. "So, a new style?" Uncle raised an eyebrow. "I thought I'd try something different for a change." The teenager shrugged. "You like it?" "It suits you," Iroh said and ran his hand through Zuko's short hair. The boy didn't flinch away from the touch, not even when Iroh's fingers brushed against his scar.